All right, so hello everyone. Welcome to the Center for Transportation Logistics Center Seminar Series, and which is organized by the IMA and CTL Center. We're extremely delighted and honored to have with us Professor Milind Soni, who is a professor of operations management at the ISB with us today. He's also in our advisory committee and also helps to direct some of these activities at the center. So we're very delighted to have with you today. So the topic of this seminar is It's Not Simply Luck, the impact of schedule padding and operational improvements on-time performance of flights. A bit about Professor Soni. He's a professor of operations management at the ISB. His other academic appointments include visiting positions at the Kellogg School of Management, Northwestern University. He has been a visiting scholar at the Krannert School of Management, Purdue University, and the Stern School of Business at New York University. Professor Soni's research broadly spans 4 interconnected areas: mobility, platform operations and revenue management, transportation logistics, information sharing, competition and incentives in supply chain management, and nonprofit and developmental sustainable operations. His research is motivated by practice and uses data from the industry. He used analytical and empirical modeling tools, game theoretic analysis, large-scale computational optimization, and data-driven methods in his research. Some of his research insights, algorithms, and solutions have been implemented in practice to improve operational outcomes from the firms. Governmental agencies and policymakers have also quoted some of his work. He has published several research articles in top-tier academic journals, including Management Science, OR, MSOM. He serves as an associate editor for leading top-tier academic journals in operations management. Professor Soni has several years of corporate experience in consulting and research. Before joining ISB, he was a research advisor with the R&D group at Delta Technology, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Delta Airlines, which is at Atlanta, Georgia. All before that, he worked with the Advanced Decision Support Systems group at AT&T Bell Labs and Ryder Dedicated Logistics based out in Miami in Florida. So again, thank you so much for all the participants for joining us today, and let us welcome Professor Soni for this seminar. And please put your questions in your Q&A tab, and we'll be moderating it as well. So welcome, Professor Soni.
So thanks, Professor Roy, and thanks, Avi. And it is a pleasure to come online and talk to you about this particular paper that we've been working on. And of course, great to be involved with the CTL that is doing fantastic work at IMA and actually even beyond, right, in this space of transportation and logistics. So today, what I have planned for this talk is to talk about one of the papers. This paper, by the way, is under submission, and it is very, it's in a minor revision at Production and Operations Management. And this is joint work with my 2 co-authors, Vinayak, who's at UNC Chapel Hill, and Chandrasekhar, who's at UT Dallas. So Chandrasekhar is graduating from UT Dallas as a PhD student, right? So the title of this paper is, as Devjit pointed out, is that it's not simply luck, the impact of schedule padding and operational improvement on-time performance flights. And I should have been a little more precise, actually, in the title. I should have written, US domestic flights, because most of our data collection is from the United States. And we look at, but what I can assure you is that our findings are fairly general, and, the criticism that we actually work on is also fairly general. So you see that in Indian aviation also, you see that in aviation across the globe, not just in the US, right? So, and I'll point out to you as the talk proceeds as to what is it that we are interested in looking at, right? So here is, what we started out with. So this question really is about and motivated from this, things that we observe out there when you take a flight, right? And often you will see that flights get delayed or canceled, and nothing surprising about it. This happens world over. And I think there is some rough estimate that on a regular basis, in fact, in daily operations, about 15 to 20% of the flights are always, there is some problem that they're either delayed or running late, or there is some other issue that is going on, right? And there have been studies, right, that have looked at this question and wondered about what is the cost to airlines and the economy, right? And here is a little snapshot from the Federal Aviation Authority's website, right, as to what is the cost of delays. And this is in billions of dollars, of course, in the United States, from 2016 through 2019. And you can see that the cost is quite significant. I mean, not just to the airlines, but also to the passengers. And in fact, there is this notional cost of cost demand, and then the indirect costs that society as such faces. And in fact, there was one congressional study that was done in around 97, if I'm not mistaken. 2007, if I'm not mistaken, that looked at this question about what is this delay cost. And there, I mean, the report that was submitted to the Congress again in 2007 stated that it was in several billions of dollars. And part of it, in fact, they actually teased out what were the causes that were for these costs. And part of it was attributed, and a significant part was attributed to something called schedule padding. Essentially, airlines tend to add additional minutes to their flight times, right? And I'll explain that in a moment, what is a flight time. And that is where a lot of the cost is incurred. So in a sense, right, that while delays and cancellations are something that bother airlines, right, and they are, worried about these costs, there is the other side of the story that they are trying to manage that, right? Because from an airline's perspective, they are continuously measuring something that is called as their on-time performance. And what do I mean by on-time performance? Basically, after the airline publishes its schedule, where it tells you, what is the departure time and what is the arrival time of a particular flight, it goes back and then looks at when the flight is actually operated, did it actually meet those times? So did it depart on time? Did it arrive on time? Or if it arrived, a few minutes later? And different sovereign countries, right? So particularly in the United States, right, that this arrival on time, they give the airlines a leeway of about 15 minutes. And if you arrive within 15 minutes of your published arrival time, the flight is considered on time. If it is beyond 15 minutes, then it is marked as, arrive late, right? And world over, and definitely in the United States, airlines are measured on this. So what does the Federal Aviation Authority do? And this equivalent authority here in India, which is the DGCA, they compute for every airline the fraction of flights that are not delayed, right? And that is based on what is the published schedule and how was the schedule operated in real time. And they publish this data for every airline for every month. And in fact, there are agencies like the OAG that actually collate this kind of information and put out this information for consumption. And who consumes this kind of information? Of course, people who are traveling and companies that are making contracts with airlines. They're looking at this kind of performance. And there is significant research that there are also financial outcomes or marketing outcomes for doing good on this particular measure, the on-time performance measure. And it is a globally accepted metric to demonstrate, an airline's punctuality, its service reliability, and hopefully attract, newer travelers or retain the current travelers to continue to fly with the airlines itself. Right. So this is something that all airlines globally are worried about. How are they doing on their on-time performance metric? And for an operations person, this is great, right? Because this is a reflection of how are they actually operating their schedule on a daily basis. However, and as I just said, right, that while on-time performance is something that is core to airline operations, in a competitive world, right, when multiple airlines are operating in similar markets or in similar geographies, they try to compete on who is doing worse or who is doing better on this on-time performance metric. And actually, airlines get ranked, right, based on their on-time performance on a monthly basis. And airlines that sometimes that are doing better on their on-time performance may show up as high rank, and they will proudly, talk about this. And you can see this in the press, right? That, they will have this best airline, worst airline, basically, figuring out what is it that the on-time performance, of a particular airline is. Now, competition is good, and it actually brings about the best in airlines. And what has also been shown is that both OTP and OTP rankings are directly related to profitability of the airline. So, how it does on the financial markets, as well as the market share, right? So there is, as I earlier said, there is enough research that points to, to these two facts, that it's not just about the on-time performance of in absolute terms, but it is also about how you are perceived vis-a-vis your competition in the market based on this measure itself. And it is, as I said earlier, a measure of schedule reliability, right? So it affects airlines, and airlines are bothered about it. But there is a slight challenge in this, right? Because if you look at data, and I have, for representative purposes, I have two airlines plotted out here, and from the data that we collected for them, right? One would think that if an airline made an effort to improve its on-time performance, right, then its rankings automatically should do better, because, the rank of an airline is dependent on how well or how many flights it completed on time. Right, so that is, it seems like that should be the norm. However, notice something right here in this picture. So the picture that I have here is for Delta Airlines and United, and the solid line, right? The solid line is the OTP performance over years, and this is from 2005 until 2015. And on the two axes, on the left axis, you're looking at the OTP. Think of it as the number of percentage of flights that were completed on time. And on the right axis is what was the rank of the airline. And here you're looking at about a group of 12 airlines that were operating in this time period from 2005 to 2015. And what I have, the blue one is for Delta and the red one is for United. And what you're seeing right here is that one would expect a negative correlation between OTP and OTP ranking, that the better the OTP, or the higher the OTP, the lower the rank. In the sense, you're doing better. You're kind of going closer to being number one, right? And that's not the case, because if you look at what is in this part of the picture right here, right? So from 2005 until 2010 for Delta, while the OTP was improving, the ranking was actually worsening, right? So it is not obvious from the way airlines adjust this and the kind of effort that they put into, this improving their on-time performance, that their rankings will also go up. And the same, argumentation you can see at different parts right here with United, right? Overall, yes, there seems to be some kind of negative correlation, but there are, significant chunks of time periods when that may or may not be happening, right? So that it wasn't clear to us that just improving on-time performance, does that always, or result in the rank of an airline also improving? And when I say improving, means going to the reducing in numeric value, right? So that's what you're seeing right here. So, which then we kind of intrigued us, and we said, I'm pretty sure, people have studied this phenomenon, and people have gone off and looked at, why or what affects on-time performance of airlines, and what can one glean in terms of rankings. And there is literature. I mean, there is a large literature that looks at flight delays and on-time performance, and I have just listed a few academic papers in this domain. There is also a lot of literature, by the way, in the non-academic side of the world, right? That where people talk about this. And there are econometric models, and there are analytical and stochastic and robust scheduling models. And, several of my colleagues have worked in this area, including myself. But there is no systematic study that we could come across that looked at this question of studying this impact And what is it that airlines are doing, right, in terms of active and passive actions that they're taking in order to improve their OTP, and then how does it affect, ranking. So we kind of were intrigued that, wow, people have looked at several questions of scheduling decisions, congestion, utilization, revenue, competition on OTP, but not specifically in terms of, what is happening with the way airlines are allocating, and is it really working for the industry, right? So that's where we position ourselves. But before I get to the key question and the key hypotheses, then we started to frame for ourselves. Let me give you a little background on airline planning and operations, and as to how do airlines think about doing this on a daily basis, right? So think about it. For example, let us say that you have a flight from Hyderabad to Mumbai, right, or to Ahmedabad, for example, right? And what typically airlines do is they will see, I mean, depending on how they have operated this flight and at what time in the day, which day of the week, which month of the year this flight is operating, they will collect a lot of data on this particular flight and its operation. And some days you may complete the flight, let's say from here to Ahmedabad, in an hour and 50 minutes. Some days you will do it in an hour and a half. Some days you'll do it in 2 hours 10 minutes, and you will have this distribution of times in which you've completed the flight from Hyderabad to Ahmedabad. Now, let us say that an airline is trying to actively work on improving its OTP. So in a particular month, it observes its OTP, basically how many times in this month. So let's say it's a daily flight, right? And you have multiple instances of this daily flight that is operating. You will collect all that data. And for example, you could have 30 data points or 40 data points for this flight in a month. And you will say, okay, how many times did I complete on time? How many times did I not complete on time? And let's say 70% of the times you were there, 30% of the times you were not there, right? Now, what will happen is that the scheduling manager, based on how the firm is ranked or the airline is ranked vis-a-vis its competition, and maybe in this market, maybe across markets, they will look at the distribution of flight completion times. And then for the next period, which is, let us say they're planning for the month of February or even March, sometimes it's done over quarters, they will choose what is the best published schedule time that they must pick from what they have observed about this flight in the past, right? So depending on the distribution, they could just pick a number. Let's say they pick the 65th percentile, right? And now why 65th percentile? I mean, a lot of things get into there, because notice that almost all the costs, at least the planning costs that are associated with, depends on what is the flying time, or in airline parlance, this is sometimes called the block time. What is it chosen for a particular flight? Because crew pays, cabin crew pays, utilization of aircraft, opportunity cost of revenue flights. All of that is a function of how much time you've planned to complete a particular flight, right? Because that will determine then how your resources get utilized and how much you need to either pay them or the opportunity cost of using those resources, right? So how do you pick that 65th percentile? Oh, it could be as ad hoc as, this year we need to be good on our OTP, on-time performance. So let's go ahead and pick the 65th percentile. Or, oh, there is significant cost pressure. We can't just, increase this. Let's move to 68th percentile, right? So this choice of what percentile to pick from the distribution tends to be a managerial decision that you have to make upfront while planning the schedule, which then gets published, right? Because once you pick those, then your flight time is determined, your departure time is known, because that is driven by a lot of the marketing parameters. And then you can say, oh, this flight we are planning to complete in 1 hour 50 minutes. So if you leave at 10, by 11:50 you will be in Ahmedabad, and so on and so forth, right? So that's how the number gets picked. Now, a risk-averse manager could go ahead and pick the 75th percentile. So he could say, no, it should be 2 hours 10 minutes. And more often than not, you would actually complete the flight well before 2 hours and 10 minutes. But if you picked 1 hour and 50 minutes, then you may more often actually not complete the time in 1 hour 50 minutes, and you would look bad on the OTP. So the choice of this percentile matters a lot. And but that's standard. I mean, that seems like a rational thing to do, and that's what most managers end up doing. Now, herein comes two things, right? That see, one is that if I just wanted to look good on the on-time performance, I could be very lax and I could choose a higher percentile score, right? I could say 70% or the 75th percentile. And I'm just adding extra minutes because the nominal time of flying from location A to location B may be well under the number that I chose, right? The block time that I chose. The extra minutes that I just added is called a pad. And I've just padded up this flying time or the block time, and I'm going to pay for it. But this is what we are calling passive action. This is like, I'm not going to do much about the way I operate my airlines. I will just pad my schedule. So that will automatically, allow me deficiencies that exist, right? And in classic inventory theory, we already know this, right? That we carry safety stock, but safety stock or extra inventory is a way of hiding inefficiencies in our processes and the way we are forecasting demand, because this is my security, right? That I have more of it. So here I have more time. And the analogy is perfect in this case. I just add more time. So that's a passive action. However, airlines could choose to do something more, that they could still say, you know what, no, we will not add too many padded minutes. We will still try to keep it under control because it costs me, and that cost is just lost money. However, I will spend a lot of effort in making sure that I can complete my flight within that time. And it could be simple things like making sure my gate agents are there on time, making sure I board my passengers on time, making sure I turn an aircraft around in time, which includes catering services, fueling, all of that stuff. Making sure that my aircraft are well maintained, that I don't have line maintenance problems on the day of operation, which then forces me to delay. So often at the airports, you will hear, right, incoming aircraft was late. Right. And why is that? I mean, so I will make sure and that is again costly. It's not that it is cost free, but those are active actions that an airline can take and improve its operations in order to maintain or make sure that it completes a particular flight time. So those we are defining as active actions. And these are again managerial decisions. How much of one versus how much of the other. So how should I, change my allocation between how much active actions do I take and how many passive action by simply padding my schedule, right? And airlines get criticized for this all the time, right? So if you go look in the popular press, right, and you will see a lot of criticism on airlines. Airline padding, airlines just basically do this to improve on-time performance. Some go on to say that why airline on-time performance stats are useless because it's not a reflection of their operations. It's only about this padding. And you will also see airlines trying to defend themselves that we just don't pad schedules endlessly. We focus on making our operations work more efficiently and get on time. So airlines are really trying to tell the world, it's not just that we are doing this. See, there is a necessary evil. We need to pad schedules, but that is, we want to do it nominally. We want to spend more time or effort on improving our operations. But airlines, and there is a lot of media that goes around this, right? Oh, this is all fake. This is just carrying extra baggage in the system itself, right? So the goal for us was to basically answer this question, right? That is padding necessary? I mean, and is that the only thing that is driving on-time performance? Are airlines actually investing in operations and making an impact through operations and trying to improve their schedule performance? And what impact does each of these have? I mean, right? I mean, without doing any analysis, if I just ask you the question, if I add more minutes, will my on-time performance increase? Most likely you will say, yeah, I mean, what's the big deal, right? I mean, you just gave yourself more slack. So the on-time performance increased. So yes, that is true, but we want to tease out the magnitude of that improvement. That how big is it, vis-a-vis the other active actions that the airlines are actually taking. So we want to look at that relative magnitude. And we also want to, as I just showed you, that it wasn't clear to us that on-time rankings, the on-time performance rankings actually always improve, or there is a bigger chance. And which of these two tools, right? The operational improvements, the active improvements, or the passive schedule padding kind of improvements have a larger impact on these on-time performance rankings? Because, I mean, think about it, right? Often, senior management compensation is directly linked to this? And is it simply just the luck of the draw that, the airline is showing up as the best airline? I mean, it could just be that, right? Some airlines suffered because of something else, and then, some other airline looked good, and the CEO got compensated, or the senior management got compensated on the airline's performance. So there is financial implications for these kinds of things here, right here, and is that right? And then from a game theoretic perspective, if you start thinking about this, right, that if everybody is doing the same thing simultaneously, adding more buffer, adding and trying to play the game of rankings, then what is the impact of your competition on the decisions that you make, right, in terms of adopting these passive or active strategies? So those were the questions that immediately popped out, and we said, what, maybe it's worth going through this exercise and starting to tease out this information, right? So that's where we started. Now, to answer this question, of course, we had to collect a lot of data, right? Because while I work with airlines, and I had a sense of how some of these decisions are being made, but does it show up in the data, right? Actually, because we wanted to make an informed decision and actually tease all of this out from the data. So what we did was we decided to construct a huge panel, right? And what we looked at was we looked at the ASPM 77. So in the United States, the Bureau of Transportation and Statistics, they maintain, just like DGCA maintains in India, the BTS maintains a lot of data about air transportation and air transport systems in the US, right? And there are, of course, the good part about studying the United States and the domestic flights in the United States is because air transport is a significant, influencer for passenger traffic. I mean, apart from road transportation, air is probably the largest, right? And there is very systematic data that is readily available, for analysis. And just the air networks and the airlines are far, far bigger. And you see a lot of variance across each one of them. So we had this data at our disposal. And what we did was we curated a data set for about 10 years, 11 years, right? Starting from 2005 to 2015. And we got all the on-time performance parameters for every single flight that operated out of these 77 major airports in the United States, right? Which included about, and we also then, went to the aircraft registry database because we needed to know the exact tail numbers and the make of these aircraft. We also needed to know, precipitation data because we had to build these models on on-time performance and delays, right? So we had to understand that. We also had to get the T100 segment data on the prices, fares, and other, information that we had about airlines. So we had to collate this from different sources. And in the end, we curated a data set for 11 years with about 49 million flights for 12 airlines, right? And, for those who were aware that in this 11 years, of course, not everything was static, right? Because, there were mergers and there were things that happened. So we had to also analyze and account for those changes within the airlines that, changed names or got merged with somebody else and how their flight schedules changed, right? So we had to do a lot of data, collection and data cleaning and data collation in order to create this data set for us to study. But having done this, right, then the question was that how do we start thinking about teasing out the impact on on-time performance that we can attribute to active and passive actions. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to call active actions as operational improvements, clubbing it as a big bucket of things that airlines do. And passive, I'm going to restrict to buffering, or basically schedule padding, adding these extra minutes on the flight time, right? So just to give you a brief picture about what do I mean by this buffering and what is it that one needs to compute. So think of a typical flight, right? And the various stages that a particular flight goes in. So what the airlines publish is the CRS departure time, which is the scheduled departure time. And they also publish this CRS arrival time. So this is the time, right, between the CRS departure time and the CRS arrival time. This is called the scheduled block time, right? Now, as part of this scheduled block time, there is the process of taxiing out. So once the aircraft pushes back, then queuing up for the taxi queue, for the takeoff queue, then the air time, which is the en route time, and then once it arrives into the airspace of the destination airport, then there is this whole holding and landing, and then there is the taxi in to the arrival gate itself, right? So those are the various components that are separately estimated in the computation of this scheduled block time. However, what you will realize is that on the day of departure, the actual departure time may differ from what has been scheduled. The wheels off and wheels on means the actual time that the aircraft was in flight, right? And then when it actually arrives may be very different from what was planned, right? So the arrival delay is the time difference between actual arrival and the scheduled arrival. The departure can be delayed for multiple reasons. Basically, things like the late aircraft came in late, or the boarding processes were messed up. All of that can occur. So the importance for us was to remove these extraneous factors that cannot be attributed to this particular flight. So if I looked at this flight, right, there are reasons why the flight got delayed, but which are not attributable to the flight. For example, a late incoming aircraft is not this particular flight that is under consideration's problem. That was the earlier flight that the aircraft was flying got delayed, right? So there was a spillover of that delay. However, all the things that happened from the time that it departed, or it was scheduled to depart, to the time that it actually arrived can be delayed too, and that is what we are calling the truncated or the intrinsic delay that I can attribute to this particular flight, right? And there is this very nice paper by my actually other two co-authors, right? Arikan Mazar and Deshpande Vinayak in MSOM, the 2012 paper, where they actually show that this truncated block time, right? This truncated demand, which is intrinsic demand of a particular flight itself, is what we are calling its distribution, can be nicely characterized using a log Laplace distribution, right? So this result has already been shown and verified in this 2012 paper, which was our initial segue, that we said, oh, great, we know that we can fit, and we actually went back and verified their results with the data set that we had. And we know that for any flight in our data, we can use a log Laplace transform. We can use this distribution in order to understand how is the flying time or the intrinsic block time of this particular flight distributed, which then now helps us start coming up with metrics that are of interest to us. So using, their model, right, so which was that the way one can then describe this, that the log of the intrinsic block time is a function of two things. One is, so several things actually, which is represented by this vector x. I'm not going to get into details of their model, but the way they characterize it is that this x is basically all your scheduling parameters. Think of origin, destination that a flight is operating between, the day of the week of the month of the year, origin, specific congestion parameters, destination specific congestion parameters, which could include precipitation. So there is a big list of characteristics that, and using that, one can regress the log of the distribution, the intrinsic travel time or the block time of a particular flight. And it turns out that these error terms are distributed like a log Laplace, with the mu being given, or this basically intrinsic distribution is distributed with log Laplace, with the mean being given by this term, and the variance can be split into three parts: the variance that comes in because of the origin airport, the variance that comes in because of the destination airport, and the variation that is very carrier specific, because different carriers have different scheduling policies, and and the way then we use this is, given this distribution, then I can think of on-time performance as a newsboy or a Bernoulli random variable. that you pick a block time, right? And I know the distribution, then either I arrive before or I arrive later. And that probability that I will arrive before what has been specified in my schedule itself is given by the log Laplace probability distribution itself. So I can compute that, and I can simply treat every flight as a coin flip. This is the probability of coming on time, and 1 minus that is the probability of being delayed. This allows me two things, right? One is that I don't have to worry about specific metrics like 15 minutes or 30 minutes after time, right? Because I can easily adjust for that. That starts becoming meaningless. It's basically saying that, see, this is what I observe, but the best unbiased estimate is my expected value. And how give whatever you choose, given that, I can tell you what is the chance that I would arrive before the time that you scheduled, or I could arrive after. And that's what we use as a probability distribution matrix. Now, in the interest of time, I will skip these two slides, but I'll show you now the most important part of our paper itself, and the way we use this log Laplace distribution in order to tease out the key attributable decisions, which is the impact of network decisions, buffering decisions, and then operational decisions that the airline, right? So just bear with me. Let me explain, hopefully, in a more pictorial format as to what is it that we are doing, right? So think of the panel data set that we have, 2005 to 2015. And you as a planner are in a particular year T, right? So where you're trying to plan for that time period T, right? Now, there are several changes that are going to happen. So let us say that in the year T minus 1, right, you had operated a particular schedule and you had observed what the on-time performance of that schedule was. Now, let's suppose I told you this, that you are not going to make any change in your buffering strategy or in your operations, the way you're operating flight. The only change you are going to make is scheduling decisions. Maybe you will move your flight time, departure times, arrival times a little bit. Maybe you will think about which airports and the time at the airports, and think about precipitation, congestion, and maybe adjust for those. So all those, right, network changes that you're going to make, those are the only things that you are going to do, right? The rest, you're going to operate exactly the same flights that you were doing in the previous year. You're not going to worry. Your buffering strategy, if you were picking 65th percentile or X percentile, you're going to continue with that. You're not going to change that. And you're not going to worry about any operational changes. Basically, so if I go back here, the mu and the sigma are going to remain the same even into the future. Now, if that were the case, then any change that I will see from the base OTP, which is what you had operated last year, and assuming that you would continue to do in the same year, I can attribute any change that I'm going to see to what I'm going to call as the network related OTP, things that you did to schedules, change the schedules. Now, once I compute that network related schedule, attribute the OTP that I can attribute to network changes. Now, given the network that you are going to operate in the current year, I can now ask you, what did you actually do in terms of your buffering, right? Having accounted for the network. And now if I tease out the impact of just the buffering strategy, the operations remaining the same and the network remaining unchanged from what you had operated in this year, I can then attribute the change in the OTP to your buffering strategy. And then beyond that, as I see how the operations panned out in that particular year, I can recompute the mu and sigma, because now I have data about how, what your actual performance was. And the mu and sigma are directly related to the operational changes that you may have made, not your buffering strategy. Then accounting for your buffering strategy, over and above that, if you had made operational changes, I can attribute that portion of the OTP change to the operations strategy itself. So it's a little nuanced, and it is quite, I mean, this is the crux of the paper. And I mean, it will be very hard for me to do this in a 45-minute session, but we actually take the structure of decision making and we model that step by step. So we have 3 clean steps, and we tease out the impact of network, buffer, and ops. And of course, what we know is the actual OTP in the year, because the actual OTP was either the flight was on time or not on time. And that is simply a Bernoulli random variable, which we can simply measure corresponding to the previous year and this year. The difference then tells me what the change in the OTP for a given year, for a given month, and for a given carrier has been, which I can then attribute or somehow figure out how it depended on these 3 changes that you had made: the network change, the buffering strategy change, and the operation strategy change, or the operation improvement that you had, right? So that's what we do, and we do quite elaborately that. So here is one simple example, right? So in any year T, my network and scheduling decisions are the X variable, the ones that I just told you, that a list of variables, they're all available within the paper. Then I know my buffering strategy, which was exactly what I'm going to use from my previous year. And I know my operation strategy, which I can impute using a regression model. So if I said that the base year, I'm going to act exactly the way I did in the last year, I can recompute what would have my scheduling decisions or my block time scheduling decisions been had I operated just as the way I had operated in my previous year. And then using the log Laplace distributional form, I can compute the average base OTP that will give me a comparison, the baseline comparison for any changes that I'm going to make, right? The only critical thing that you must notice is that we not only take into account what the airline has done to itself, or has done itself in the past year, we also account for the average impact of what the competitors have done, so that we can also tease out the effect of competition in this case. So that gives us our base OTP. Now you get the drift. We will change our scheduling decision from the previous year to the current year. So we change xt minus 1 to t, but keep the buffering strategy and the operational strategy the same as our previous year, because now we just want to figure out or tease out the impact of scheduling decisions. We rerun our log regression models right here. But in this case, we are now going to use, notice, the current year's schedule, right? And come up with, had we used the previous year's strategy for buffering and operations and simply change the schedule, what would our predicted block times be, right? This is not the actual ones that we have attributed, because those are after buffering, and we still have to tease out the impact of buffering. But had we not done any buffering and just operated just as before, this is what we would have predicted the block times for our individual flights to be. And that compared to, if I had operated as before, what would my log Laplace distribution parameters be, the predicted parameters be for the new schedule xt, the mu predict and the sigma predict. And that is the attribution that I can make to network changes. So we compute the network changes, take the average over for a given time, year, given month, and a given carrier. And the difference between the base and the net is what we are calling the delta that we can attribute to network related changes. Now you get the drift. I change my network from xt minus 1 to xt. Now I already know what were the block times you had assigned in year T. And that had included the buffering strategy that you had, right? Because if you had not done, then I would have predicted these QTI predict, right? This is what I would have predicted your block times to be. But since in the data I already observed, from instead of predicted, you are operating with this QT, whatever your block times you had chosen, and that is data, I can simply, instead of the network OTP that drove this, I can go back and compute what the buffer related OTP is, by using the predicted mu and the sigma, assuming that everything else is the same, the network has changed, and now your buffering strategy over that has also changed. And that gives me the difference. And when I take an average and take the difference between the buffered OTP metric and the network related OTP metric, that difference then tells me what I can attribute to purely buffering over and above the schedule changes, the network changes that I made. And similarly now, I will go back and recompute my operational parameters from the regression that we had before. And I will update those to new regression parameters, because now you have changed the buffer. Your Qs have operated, and your alphas and betas in the regression will also change now. So if I go back and now recompute what your mu actual and sigma actual were, right? Because now you have changed the Q and the operations happened. And now if I regress this to this year, QT, with what I observe as the on-time performance in this particular year, that will be also an impact of how much happened because of the operational changes, because that is also included now. And the difference between that operations, again, averaged over, the number of flights that operated in that year, that month, and for that carrier, compared to the buffered OTP, will give me the OTP changes because of operational changes that happened in that year. Notice that now I have updated to this particular year and recomputed the operational parameters of my regression. And finally, I have the actual OTP of the year. As I just said, every flight is a Bernoulli trial. So I can simply think of an indicator variable, either the flight is on time or not on time. And for every flight that operated in this year, or this month, for the carrier, either it was on time or not on time. This is a binary variable. And I just sum it over and divide it, give me an average, and that gets me the average OTP. And the difference between the actual of this year and the actual of the previous year will tell me what the change in the OTP was I observed over the 2 years, right? And what am I going to do now? I'm going to run this delta OTP as a function of the network, buffer, and operations changes, OTPs that I did. And I will now try to figure out who loads up, right? Who is the most correlated with the change in the final OTP, or the actual change in the OTP that I see for a particular airline in a year, in a month, right? So that's the core idea. It took us a long time and a lot of, algebra to put this through. I mean, it's not very complicated. It's just about knowing the structure in the way the decisions are being made and mapping those variables back and making sure that we do a careful teasing out of these individual impacts that we wanted to study, right? So the goal essentially is to study the effect of delta net, delta buff, delta ops on delta ODP for a given year, month, and carrier combination. Okay, so that's what we have up until now. So we've been able to build this data set, tease out this information, and build this massive data, curated data set for running our regressions, which then now leads us to stating our hypotheses that we want to test, right? So the first one, fairly innocuous, right, that we wanted to test was that any change in OTP is related to the change in network. Then any change in OTP is, of course, and when I say related, is it positively associated with block time buffers and is positively associated with operational improvements, right? So, but more importantly, we were interested in the relative magnitude and ranking of these three, right? Basically, where are airlines putting in most of their effort in order to start seeing these changes? So additionally, what we wanted to do was we wanted to see, as I said, which one has the highest impact. So we have to do the standardized estimate scores for these one. And does planned OTP change through adjustment of block time and it will fully translate into actual change in OTP. So we also wanted to look at these two questions in addition to the hypothesis that we had. So here is basically the regression that we ran, right? As I said, And of course, we had controls. So we did control for, carrier specific, month specific information, then a whole bunch of other, fixed effects that we had to put in there. And as you can see right here, which is a dead giveaway, that notice that all three are significant. So basically the story is that yes, buffering helps, making network changes helps, buffering helps, but what you will see is that operations has the largest impact on the change in the OTP itself, right? Which is kind of vindicating the airlines a little bit. It's saying that, see, yes, they do buffering, and buffering is positively associated with change in the OTP, so doing better in OTP. But they are spending a lot of effort in actually improving their operations, and that is, because I'm looking at standardized estimates which I can compare, right? And that is, significantly higher than both of them. In fact, we find this result fairly robust to others. So we did a whole bunch of other robustnesses. I'll talk about that towards the end of the talk. But and these are very significant, right? So we were able to, show that very clearly. So the main insights up until now that we were able to get is, all of them are significant association. Operational improvements have highest, and the impact of operational improvement translates fully to actual OTP change, right? So think about the regression equation itself, right? What we are saying is that, 0.62. So it is like every minute, or I can gain right over here in delta operation, that translates directly to, change in OTP itself, right? So it kind of, sorry, not 0.62, but 0.929, right? So it's almost 1-to-1, right? Translation for every operational, impact that I can get over here. So that's something that was kind of revealing to us and vindicates the airlines from, doing this. But the trickier question was the rankings itself, right? And think about rankings, right? How do you measure rankings? So, rankings, of course, are on an ordinal scale, 1 through, we had 12 airlines, so we were seeing airlines going up. And if you are already first, you cannot improve. If you're already last, you cannot worsen, right, in the following year. So how does one measure improvement or worsening? And if it is two airlines, they are perfectly correlated, right? If one does better, the other one has to do worse, right? So the saving case for us was that there were just not two airlines, there were 12 airlines. So even if I dropped one airline, it is impossible to guess how the ranks of the others might have moved. So that was a good thing, right? Otherwise, it was a perfectly correlated data set. And we had to adjust for the fact that if you were already at the top or already at the bottom, the change in the ranking may not show up, right? Because though you may have gotten an operational improvement or an on-time performance improvement, you are not going to do any better than what you already had done, or not going to do any worse than what you were already doing, right? So we had to kind of consider those. And as I had argued earlier, that there didn't seem to be any negative correlation to begin with, right? So something that we had to buy. So the way we were going to measure rank was we were going to look at the rank from the previous year, the change to the current year. So the current year being T, the previous year being T-1. And we, instead of using the ordinal scale, right, we said that let us convert this to a binary variable so that we could use a logistics regression. And what we did was we said that, the change is 0 if the rank is positive, that the change in the rank is positive, otherwise it is 1, right? So this is how we translated. So we were just looking at movement rather than, so either you stay still or worsen, or you go up, right? And the probability that there is this you worsen, right, is 1. So that's what we were taking, and we ran a logistics regression. But notice we had to control in the controls. We did control for the current rank of the airline itself. So that was some criticism that we got back from the referees, and we said that we will run a robustness test. And it didn't matter, actually. So while I don't explicitly put out the controls, we have both versions that we run in the paper. But we also wanted to look at the impact of the competitors' adjustments on their block times and the competitors' adjustments on the operational improvements that they make, right? So we also wanted to, because see, I as an airline may be responding to what my competitors are doing, and does that have an impact on the ranking then that I see for myself, right? So again, we curated the data set just as before. We ran this regression, and here are some interesting, results. So first of all, once again, right, our assertion that operations is probably the most important thing in improving rankings comes through very clearly as compared to just simply buffering strategies. But what was interesting for us to also observe was that the competitors' actions can actually have a negative impact on the ranks of an individual airline. Right. So in a sense, this mad competition that happens between airlines that one is doing, so that a result I need to buffer more and I need to schedule more is coming through very clearly, because you're seeing that there is a negative impact that what is happening. And this, of course, is statistically very significant for the data set that we ran. Right. So we were able to clearly tease these two things out. And again, once again, ascertain the fact that operations matters far more than simply passive strategies like buffer, right? So just to kind of put out the main insight from the rankings regression that we had, and which we believe is fairly robust, right? Because we checked for several other things. Competitors, like of course, they are all positively associated. Competitor buffer adjustments have significant negative impact on the ranks. And even if we control for previous year ranks for an airline, things don't change. Right, so something that was nice to show in this case. Now, in addition to all of this, right, in the interest of time, I'm very close to being the full hour, and I hope the organizers are okay with it. Let me just show you two things that we also were then worried that do different types of airlines actually have different strategies, right? And what we did was we took our data set and divided up the airlines as full service, low cost, commuter, leisure. I mean, you had all these variants over there. And we again ran, our regressions in order to make sure that how do the results show up. And what we see is that, for full service airline, basically all of the hubbers, right, and the hub and spoke kind of networks, network changes do not have a significant impact. Buffer adjustments do not have a differential impact across airline types. So all of them, do better. Operational improvements have the least impact for leisure airlines, whereas highest impact for full service and commuter airlines, which is saying that the leisure airlines are not necessarily spending too much, effort in improving or focusing on operations. They may be getting by simply, buffering strategies, right? Because probably they don't see the need at this point in time. But one advice would be that, if one had to put in this effort and, make operations better, they probably could do even, better than what they're doing right now. If one looked at route types, route types where the way we characterize route types was based on the variance in travel time. So some routes have much higher variance because they're very congested routes. Some routes are not as congested, so unimpeded rather, so you can see low variance. What we observe here is that the impact of buffer adjustment of operation increases with the decrease in coefficient of variation of travel time, right? So the larger the coefficient of variation, the impact is going to be small, right? So this is something that was a nice thing to know. So essentially decongesting some of these routes may be necessary, which then gets back to the scheduling practices and the way airports are constrained, right, in terms of the slots that they have, and all of those start becoming important to understand in this case. So just as concluding remarks then, just for me to stop, is the schedule buffering plays a significant role. It may be a necessary evil, right? As you cannot completely do away with it. Airlines are going to do away with it, but it's not like airlines are simply focused on that. So yes, we should point it out, but no point beating them up on it. It's no point. However, we do find vindication for airlines that operational improvements both has the highest impact on OTP and OTP rankings, and the effect of competition is quite significant. Buffering strategies are impacted too, because airlines are playing this game of operations and they are responding to each other, right? So that is something that comes through in our analysis quite significantly. So yeah, there I am. I can stop here. I can take a few questions. Any thoughts, comments?
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you, Milind. This is fascinating. In fact, in operations, we actually discuss that don't focus on time measure.
Yeah.
Focus on the operations, because always we can have, padding delays and all, which we can add to ensure we're always on time. And that's exactly what your results kind of also alluded to,
Yeah.
is focus on more operations thing rather than the end outcome. And that is kind of fascinating.
True.
There are a few
So
questions.
this is a pitch for operations management.
Yeah, it was great.
True.
There are a few questions that came also along the way.
Yeah.
And one question by Suresh was that, I think you were specific for one slide probably, but he says, don't you think it also depends on allocated slot at airports, specifically if it is a coordinated airport?
Yes, it does. So that's what I meant by, so if you go back to the network changes, right? You're right, this X, right, accounts for all of that. I haven't listed, the various features of X, but we look at, time of day, slot and the congestion and the capacity of the airport at that point in time also. Because, so there is a long list that goes into these network decisions that we account for.
Wonderful. There's a second question by Srinivasan. He says, on the rank and OTP, in my observations, there's always a delay, a few years or so, in the improvement of ranking compared to the OTP performance. This can be also seen in your data. However, if you see that OTP of an airline is quite high over a longer period of time, say 10 years in a row, then the rank will also be high too after initial years. Moreover, the ranking, it's not over yet, one more line. Moreover, the ranking also would depend on not just the airline's OTP, but also how other airlines in the country perform with respect to OTPs. Yeah, just a view on this.
No, absolutely. You're right. And all of those observations are very good. And in fact, the last one, right, we do account for competition. So that was something that we do specifically account for as to how other airlines are doing their stuff. The lag, we don't particularly, worry about it because we are aggregating for a typical, operation month. So that's what we are looking at.
But I think also what this could lead to, do we need to look at regressors for the lags and for the?
So yeah, one could potentially do that, but in terms of our analysis, right, what we are looking at 3-year periods. So
Okay.
Year T-1 and T-2, because all the buildup happens to T using data and information of T-. So we have that much of information already within.
Got you. Yeah. And there's a final question from Dheeraj. Will schedule padding not reduce utilization of crew time?
Yeah, that is the cost, right? So remember when so why do airlines get, worried about this, right? Over here, and the cost there, it's a trade-off, right? Because the more I pad, the more I pay, because crew duty periods are a function of what the block time is, cabin crews are there, utilization of the aircraft. Because if I unnecessarily pad, then I could have put in a revenue flight, right, at the end of the rotation of the aircraft, but I can't now because I've consumed all of that. And many of these costs are non-linear, right? So the cost is that's something that is implicit. And if you go back to these cost computations right here, right? So the one that I put out here, these actually account for the airlines, right? When you're looking at these billions of dollars, that's where the cost is accruing for using these kinds of patterns.
And there's another question by Raj. He says, how we have identified how much padding is done by particular airlines from standard time for the sector, and how do you choose the standard time for that route?
True. No, that's the great question. So that's exactly what we do over here, right? So if you look at this distribution, right here. So see what we are saying is that the way a flight operates, it's not a static. See, there is an unimpeded time, which depends on the aircraft characteristics and the route characteristics, right? And the ceiling at which you fly. So that is the nominal time, right? But airlines and aircraft never fly that, right? Because they will file for their flight path, and then depending on the day, the weather, the congestion, all these factors, they will have a lot of variance in the time. So it is very hard to pick one number and say. So what you do is you build the distribution, and you say the expected value of the distribution is what your unbiased estimate for that travel time or the block time is going to be, because the block time, as I said, encompasses of the taxi out, flying, and taxi in, and the holding patterns that are there. So all of those uncertainties are enfolded in the block time, right? And the best estimate for you is going to be the expected value. Now, different airlines pick, as I said, a different fractile or a percentile. So that is what we are teasing out through the analysis on over here, right? By using a distributional fit, which is a log Laplace distribution, and then looking at the decisions that the airlines made through the data. And the difference is telling us what is the padded amount that they're adding to this.
Wonderful. Any other questions from the participants? Any final reflections, Professor Milind, if you have any?
No. I mean, I'm very excited to do. So we actually have a lot more work that we did on this. And this is something that, this might interest you too, right? So we look at behavioral aspects of how these decisions are made by the managers themselves. And what we have is we actually are empirically able to validate in the block time decision, scheduling decision, behavioral patterns, like so trend chasing. So think about it, right? Knee-jerk reaction. Knee-jerk reaction meaning that, hey, last time I didn't do well, let me pad more, right? I mean, it's a classic, so then we can also see mean anchoring effects that, hey, I think this is what should happen. I anchor to that, and every time I'm deviating, I tend to keep coming back to this. There is trend chasing, demand chasing, these kinds of behavior. So we are able to empirically show that embedded over years across airlines, across the industry, there are these behavioral biases that get embedded in this decision making. And so it has implications for even things like AI and some of these newer techniques, that if the data have this biases embedded, and if you're going to learn from data, then you're also learning the biases, implicit in the way you're picking that up. And so you have to be very careful. How do you debias some of these things, right? So we are able to actually do that. So that's a follow-on paper that we've written, and we are ready to submit.
Fascinating, very fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for joining us wherever. I think you're right now in Hyderabad, right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Great. Yeah. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful webinar. I'm sure all the participants benefited from this talk as well. And thank you again. We hope to host you in the campus sometime very soon.
Oh, I would love to come to Ahmedabad. Wonderful. Thank you for having me. And, it was great talking about this piece of work. So.
Thank you. And thank you, Avi, for organizing
it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you.
Bye.